Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with the south area, with Black Sea. During the previous 24 hours, the United States of America launched another recon operation using their RQ-4 Global Hawk above the Black Sea. Probably the United States of America were trying to collect as much as possible intelligence information from Crimea, and also as we understand now, the United States of America were correcting and helping the Ukrainians to use their drones to attack Crimea, because today the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack Russian positions in Crimea using drones, and as a result of that attack, 11 drones were shot down above the territory of Crimea with the Russian air defense systems. And this is the map of their attacks. The Ukrainians were attacking the western bank or western coast of Crimea. As an act of revenge, the Russians made their own drone attack, but when talking about the Russians attacked the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Izmail. And this is very interesting because probably this is the first piece of information we received that the Russians attacked the east part of Odessa. If we take a look at this map, Izmail is a Ukrainian settlement that located on logistic hub, and the Ukrainians using this area get support and supply from the NATO country by the name of Romania. So that was like some kind of exchange of drone attack. As we see, the Russians managed to just shut down the Ukrainians' drones, and the Ukrainians probably weren't able to shut down the Russian drones that attack the vicinity of Izmail. Furthermore, now we're going to move to Kherson, and we got at least a few interesting updates from this bridgehead. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russian sources published another piece of information that Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, on the 29th of May was wounded as a result of Russian missile attack against the main building of Ukrainian intelligence. And after that, this commander was wounded, and the Russian sources are saying that after that attack, he was first redeployed to Poland, to Warsaw, and after that he was redeployed to Berlin, and currently this man is in a critical situation, in critical conditions, and according to the Russian sources, it's very difficult to understand what exactly is going to happen with him further. But anyway, for now we are going to keep him in Berlin, at least until we got the first video or photo confirmations that he have returned back to the territory of Ukraine. Furthermore, the Ukrainians made another attempt to cross Dnipro River after a few days of some kind of silence period of time. The Ukrainians took a decision to restart their attempts to cross Dnipro River using the boats. They attacked the Russian bank of the river. Around 40 soldiers were involved in that operation. The Russians managed to discover the Ukrainians, and they managed to shut down one boat, and the rest 3 boats were forced to turn and went back to Ukrainian port. But the Russians, using intelligence and drones, managed to discover the positions of those boats, and after that they took a decision to destroy those boats using artillery systems. And as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost another boats and other ships in this area, and probably now for the next few days the Ukrainian activity in this area will be reduced at the minimal level. Now we're moving further, and another interesting update is coming from, let's say, the east part of Kherson. The Ukrainians took a decision to redeploy the forces of 124th Defense Brigade closer to the Dnipro River. We discussed during the previous videos that Ukrainians during the regrouping process were forced to redeploy a lot of brigades from like Odessa, Nikolaev and Kryvyi Rog to the Zaporizhzhia area, and they were forced to move a lot of forces from the Dnipro River, from their side of the Dnipro River, and probably that was the reason why they took a decision to move the Territory Defense Brigade closer to the combat line, and just to secure the flanks and not allow the Russians to cross the river and to attack the Ukrainian forces in Kherson, or probably even in direction of Nikolaev. Now we're going to Zaporizhzhia area after a few days of operational pause, after the few days when after the end of the rain period of time, the Ukrainians have reactivated their offensive operation, and currently we see the increase of intensifying of fightings from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians during the previous days made more attempts to attack Russian positions on Kamyanskaya front line. The Ukrainians were attacking in direction of Lvov, the Ukrainians were attacking in direction of Zherebyanka, and the Ukrainians were attacking in direction of Petykhatki. All those attacks were repelled, and the Russians published another video how they were attacking and bombing the Ukrainians' armored vehicles using artillery systems. On that video you see that Ukrainians moved very close to the combat line, their armored vehicles, probably few tanks and few armored personal carriers. As you can see on this video, the Russians managed to discover the positions of those armored vehicles, and after a few hours or probably minutes they started bombing and shelling this territory, and probably as a result of that artillery attack the Ukrainians lost those 3 armored vehicles. Of course, this is a very big loss for the Ukrainians, and we see that Ukrainians activated increased intensifying of their activity in this area after they have redeployed the forces of 130th Reconnaissance Battalion, and using probably units of that forces they were making they were doing recon combat these days in direction of the first defense line, at least on this part of the front line. The Russians reported that as a result of artillery attack and bombing they destroyed the headquarters of 128th Storm Brigade. This is the Mountain Assault Brigade 128th. Probably they attacked the headquarters and very important office of that brigade. Now we're moving to Orekhov, and currently there are on the first attack line there are 65th, 147th Mechanized Brigade and 11th Brigade of Ukrainian National Guard. And this evening, right before I start making this video, according to the Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians have activated in this area and they made another attempt to attack Russian position, according as they did before, as they did a few days ago in direction of Rabotina. The Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russians along the fields in direction of the first defense line, and from Malatakamachka to the south. According to the Russians, probably all those attacks were repelled by the Russians, but I believe that Ukrainians first of all were trying to reduce the gray zone and to prepare positions before upcoming night offensive operation that Ukrainians are planning to do during the upcoming night. So I believe that after a few days of operational pause, the Ukrainians will relaunch their offensive operation with new forces, with new power, and with more anger behind them. The Russians are saying that during the day they destroyed another ammo depot of 65th Brigade that is currently located on the combat line. Now we're moving further to a little bit to the north. The Russians reported they destroyed also ammo depot of 47th Artillery Brigade. Currently this brigade is located on Vremivka tactical bridgehead. Probably these forces of that brigade are stretched along the front line, but anyway, that is a very big loss for the Ukrainian forces, for artillery Ukrainian forces in the area where the Ukrainians have active offensive, counter-offensive operation to the south. Now we are moving to Gulai Pole area. The Ukrainians intensified their activity in this area as well, and today for the second time in a row we got another update that as a result of some recon in combat, the Russians managed to capture and destroy another commando squad on the south of Gulai Pole. Yesterday we got the same update from this territory, so probably the Ukrainians will attack during the next upcoming attempt of Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. Probably the Ukrainians are planning to attack on this bridgehead as well, and the main reason of that is that if you take a look at this map, you see that the first Russian defense line lays very far from Gulai Pole, and so this gives significant possibilities for the Ukrainians without very big losses to capture and establish control over at least this part of red cloud in this area, and probably within the next few days the Ukrainians will attack to the south in direction of Konstantinovka. The Ukrainians will attack in direction of like Pologi, Balochki, and of course the Ukrainians Ukrainians will make another attempt to attack in direction of Fyodorovka. They will try to capture the territory that we see there are no fortifications. There are small fortifications in every single forest line, in every single settlement on this bridgehead. But anyway, it is much more easier for the Ukrainians to attack in this direction than, for example, to try to penetrate this fortification, the first defense line of the Russians. Furthermore, today some Western sources, or probably the Russian sources, published a very interesting picture of original plan of the Ukrainians that they were planning to implement during the previous waves of attacks. So I'm not sure, like, is it like a real piece of information or it's not a fake from somebody? It's very difficult to understand. But anyway, based on this map, we understand that Ukrainians during this counteroffensive operation were planning to split this territory in two parts. The western one is Zaporizhzhia area and the eastern one Donetsk region, and to capture the central part and to capture such settlements like Berdyansk, like Melitopol, like Takmak, Energodar, and the bridgehead near the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. So all these territories the Ukrainians were planning to capture according to the original plan, but for now we see that they still haven't managed to bypass even the first defense line. So we'll see whether they're able to do within the next attacks in these directions. Now let's talk about Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 155 soldiers and 6 armored vehicles. We can say that the level of Ukrainian losses are the lowest since the beginning of the storming operation on Zaporizhzhia area. So probably the Ukrainians will continue doing some regrouping operations and so on. The Ministry of Defense reported that Ukrainians made few attempts to attack Russian positions in direction of Rovnopol. That attack was repelled by the Russians. Another attack was on the line between Livadna and Priutna. That attack was repelled as well, and the Ukrainians lost during those attacks 25 soldiers and 3 tanks, and probably the Ukrainians were using the forces of 128th Territory Defense Brigade that located in this area, Novosilovka, this one. And the Russians furthermore published a very interesting video how they destroyed Ukrainian convoy that probably were heading to supply and support their forces in their offensive operation. Probably most of those vehicles managed to get the combat line, but a lot of those vehicles got under Russian artillery fire, and we see that the Russians attacked very accurate, and a lot of armored vehicles were destroyed while moving along the fields. And as you can see, the Ukrainians were moving along their own fields that were under their control, so probably those fields weren't mined, or probably the Russians were using the tactics of distance mining, who knows. But anyway, we see that Ukrainians did lost a lot of vehicles during a redeployment process in direction of Livadna and in the vicinity of Livadna. Furthermore, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours they attacked Ukrainian positions in Niskuchna. They were attacking the forces of 31st Mechanized Brigade. The Russians attack and bomb positions of 1st Tank Brigade. This is the 1st Tank Brigade, so let's move it a little bit closer to the combat line. And the Russians also published another video how they supported their forces using helicopters. On this video you see how the Russians using the helicopters destroyed another few tanks, Ukrainian tanks. Basically, as you can see on this video, these are not tractors as we saw during the first days of Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. On this video we see probably the real tanks. So as you can see, the Russians continue supporting their forces on Vremivka tactical bridgehead, but we can say that the situation for the Russians is very difficult in this area. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made few attempts to attack the Russians on the hills, and some mappers are saying that this part of hills, this one, were captured by the Ukrainians, and the Russians were forced to step back further to the south to the towards more reliable positions and towards extra defense line a little bit to the south of these hills. Furthermore, the Ukrainian sources reported that Ukrainians made few attempts to attack in direction of Staromayorska, and Ukrainians made few attempts to attack in direction of Urozhaine. For now, we don't have any confirmation from the Russian side or any piece of information about the results of those attacks, but anyway, we see that Ukrainians do have some possibilities to develop their offensive operation. The weather is getting better, so probably with some activation of the Ukrainians on Zaporizhzhia front line, we're going to see another activation of the Ukrainians on this front line as well. And I'll remind you that during the previous few days, the Ukrainians redeployed the forces of 35th Marine Brigade. They redeployed the forces of 82nd Air Assault Brigade. The Ukrainians moved positions 37th 4th Tank Brigades, 68th Jaeger Brigades, 31st Mechanized. So they have accumulated a very powerful attack fist, and probably we're going to see more actions from the Ukrainians within the next few days, because we know that this NATO summit is going to take place very soon, and the Ukrainians don't have any other options, but they need to show some results. Now let's move to the Vuhledar. The Ukrainians reported that they made another attempt to reduce and maintain the gray zone between their positions in Vuhledar and the Russian positions in Pavlovka and Nikolskoye. The Ukrainians were saying that that was like another offensive operation, but to tell the truth, I'm not sure about. I believe that there was some kind of offensive operation, or the Ukrainians were trying to reduce the gray zone and they moved their forces closer to the combat line. But I believe that the main reason of that operation was that, if you remember, a few days ago we discussed that the Russians were planning to attack the Ukrainians in direction of Prichistovka and to cut supply roads of the Ukrainians using this road and so on. So I believe that that was the reason why the Ukrainians took a decision to move their forces closer to the combat line, just to avoid any surprises from the Russian side and not to allow them to be flexible. Because if the Russians launch this offensive operation in direction of Ukrainian flanks in Prichistovka, then the Ukrainians will start attacking the Russians in direction of Pavlovka and Nikolskoye, and basically this will force the Russians to change their plans and to move their reserves back to Vuhledar. So everything is very stick close to each other, and it's like a chess game, and you need to analyze and you need to calculate your steps for a lot of steps in forward. Now we're moving to Marinka. The Russians reported that Ukrainians made another attack on the north in direction of Marinka. Ukrainians were trying to push the Russians back and to regain their lost positions. Those attacks were repelled. Furthermore, the Russians reported they destroyed another ammo depot of 79th Brigade. And I'll remind you that currently there are just one unit who protect these territories, 79th Air Assault Brigade. If you remember, we discussed in this video that Ukrainians redeployed the force of 35th Marine Brigade, this one from Krasnogorovka, and we should expect that this action will reduce the power of Ukrainian forces on this front line. But I'll remind you that recently the Russians have redeployed their special unit Akhmat from this direction also to Belgorod, so probably the Ukrainians saw the Russian movements and probably they understood that they have released some reserves, and they used those and they took a decision to use those released reserves in direction of Bremevka tactical bridgehead. So currently the Ukrainians moved some forces from this area and the Russians as well, and we see the same picture that we saw months before this situation. So nothing have changed in mathematical way. And now we are moving to north to Avdiivka bridgehead. The Ukrainians made another attempt to return their lost positions in the vicinity of Pervomaiska, and probably they were trying to attack the Russians in the vicinity of Nivolskoye. Those attacks were repelled, and the Russians made another artillery strike and they bombed the Ukrainian positions of 110th Brigade in the vicinity of Avdiivka. Also, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack the Russians in the direction of Krasnogorovka, but that attack was repelled by the Russians. The total losses of the Ukrainians on the Donetsk front line were around 340 soldiers and 6 armored vehicles. As you can see, as usual, the level of losses are very heavy. So we see that we can't say that the actions and activity on this front line are reducing. We see that probably the level of losses and the level of that the actions and the combat on this front line are intensifying. Furthermore, the Russians reported Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours were trying to support their offensive forces or counteroffensive force using the airplanes of Su-27 on the north and on the south of this front line, but the Russians reported that they managed to shut down those airplanes. One of them was destroyed in the vicinity of Kramatorsk, and another one was destroyed in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. Now we are getting closer to Bakhmut, and the Russians reported that they attacked another time in a row positions and headquarters and the ammo depot of 24th Mechanized Brigade that located and that is deployed in the vicinity of Toretsk. The Russians are focused on this brigade mainly because these brigades support the Ukrainians' offensive operation in direction of Klishchiivka from the south, and basically these brigades after every single attack they lose their possibilities to support Ukrainians' 5th Assault Brigade that currently are trying to attack the same position from the north. So the Russians took a decision to use these tactics. They focus just on one brigade. They attack 24s and not allow them to attack the Russians in their back while they're repelling the attacks of 5th Assault Brigade from the north. When talking about Artyomovsk itself, there are no changes on the ground. Probably the Ukrainians continue attacking, attacks to develop their bridgehead in direction of Berkhovka and Yagidna, but as I understand, all those attempts were repelled by the Russians. Very interesting updates are coming from Razdolovka. During the day, the Ukrainians continue to attack the Russians in this area. If you remember, before Prigozhin, Wagners were redeployed from Artyomovsk. Prigozhin made a video trying to explain the Ukrainian plans in this area, and he told that the main plan that Ukrainians have for this bridgehead is to push the Russians from the settlements like Nikolskaya, Nikolaevka, Saka, Vansetin, Vasilivka, and to create this tactical bridgehead because there is a river, Bakhmutka, and it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to accumulate their forces on this bridgehead. And if they can push the Russians from this area towards this defense line, these black dots, then the Ukrainians will be able to accumulate enough of a very powerful armored fist in this area, and then they will be able to continue advancing in direction of Solidar. So currently, as I understand, the Ukrainians are trying to implement that plan by attacking in this area. And furthermore, this is not the first note and first piece of news from this bridgehead that Ukrainians were attacking to the south of Razdolovka. Now we are moving to Sever's bridgehead. The Russians attacked the positions of 54th Brigade between Zvanovka and Vyimka, and mainly 54th Brigade are trying to secure and protect. It's like the second defense line in the second defense belt from the Ukrainian side. And also the Russians published another video how they were bombing the Ukrainian positions in Belogorovka, which confirms for a 10th time in a row that this small settlement is under Ukrainian control. And the Russians are trying probably now to reduce and just to ruin these territories, and probably after that they will make another attempt to storm these territories. But I'm not sure that they're going to do this within the next months, even two, because if you remember, the main forces who were trying to capture this bridgehead was Akhmat Special Unit. But as we know today, this special unit was completely redeployed from Ukraine to Belgorod region, to the Belgorod border, and currently the Russians are trying to accumulate their forces there. Now let's talk about Kupiansk and Liman front line. There are no changes, just regular artillery duels. The Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles during the previous days, and without any changes on the ground. Very interesting updates are coming from border. Today the Russians published another video of the ending of the redeployment process of Special Unit Akhmat. Currently this unit is completely located on the western flank of Belgorod front line. And if you remember, a week ago, the head of Wagner's Prigozhin reported that their forces are going to be redeployed to Belgorod within the next 2 weeks. Probably the Wagners have already completed the redeployment process, but they're not on the combat line. Probably they're in training centers in Belgorod. We remember that the Russians completed the creation of Territory Defense Brigade in Belgorod of around 3,000 soldiers. So basically we see the first like notes of upcoming offensive operation in Belgorod. The western flank will be under responsibility of Special Akhmat unit, and the eastern and the central flanks will be under responsibility of Wagner's, and probably the Russians will launch their offensive operation in this area, trying to create a barrier. They will attack. There are like few options of that operation, or to like create a buffer in 20-30 kilometers or even more to try to capture even Kharkiv. But based on the types of forces that the Russians took a decision to redeploy in this area, something tells me that maybe they will try to capture Kharkiv as well, because as you know, special units Akhmat and Wagner's are the most effective and the most professional stormtroopers in the entire Russian army, and we see that the most experienced and the most professional stormtroopers were redeployed on the border with Belgorod, and probably not with the purpose to repel the Ukrainian scouts and commandos in the forest of this territory. Probably these units has something to do, and probably the main goal and the things that they're going to do are connected with capturing settlements and cities in this territory. I'm not sure that these forces are going to capture Kharkiv. I'm not sure what kind of army you need to capture Kharkiv, a city settlement with more than 1 million population, but the Russians can always try first to encircle this settlement. So we'll see. Anyway, Wagner's promised us to return back to the combat line on the 5th of August, so it's a little bit more than 1 month left before this event, and then we will understand everything what the Russians are planning to do. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.